Okay. Hello everyone. Hayırlı akşamlar herkese. I greet you all sincerely and I am happy to introduce to our guest, Associated Professor Ceren Acartürk from Koç University. She studied psychology at Boğaziçi University and clinical psychology at ODTÜ University. She got her PhD in clinical psychology at Vrije University in Holland. She conducts many research projects and mainly works on refugee mental health, evidence-based treatments, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Today, she will talk about two of her research projects, Redefine and Strength, which were funded through EU Horizon 2020. Now, I want to leave the screen to her.
Thank you very much, Burcu Hocam. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all, especially to see the familiar names and faces of my previous students. So I'm really happy to be here with you all. And also Fatih Hocam, tekrar merhaba. Today, as Burcu Hoca said, I would like to share two of my EU projects, Horizon 2020 projects, which are actually based on refugee mental health. So please let me share my screen first. And I think it will be better to, okay. So let's start considering the time. Okay, so in this talk, actually, I'm gonna present two projects that me and my team have been carrying out for a couple of years. One of them is Strength, one of them is Redefine projects. And but before introducing and discussing these two projects, I would like to share some very brief information on the mental health situation of refugees, especially and Syrian refugees. And this is also an art product from Nizar Ali Badr, which I really like. He's a Syrian artist who depicts the Syrian war and what the refugees have been going through these rocks. So I also like to acknowledge him. So according to UNHCR, actually there are 18 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. So 26 million of them are actually refugees, and there are also more than 45 million people who are internally displaced. This means that they are also seek refuge, but they move to other places in their own countries. And besides refugees, and there are also asylum seekers, which means that they are actually applied for refugee status. But throughout my presentation, I'm going to use the refugee term. And also even refugees in Turkey, Syrian refugees are accepted as Syrians under temporary protection. I will be using refugee term. And due to recent conflict in Venezuela, there are also more than 3 million Venezuelan displaced people currently. Okay, but if you focus on more on the Syrian refugees, since 2011, actually, with its open door policy, Turkey is now hosting world's highest number of refugees, which is 3.6 million registered Syrians currently. And as you may see, Syrians are also look refuge in other neighboring countries such as Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq, but also there are an increase, and there are also refugee Syrians living in Europe. You may all remember all these news, that how they were get forced, assaulted, and when they were on the boats or the children. So you already remember that news and the scenes probably. So, but mostly Syrians are living in the neighboring country of Syria. Actually, if you would remember the first times of the Syrian war, it was also that time with Ibrahim Şenay Hoca, we conducted maybe one of the first studies with Syrian refugees. Also Mustafa Çetinkaya was with us. We went to Kilis Mülteci camp with also Emre Konuk, and we conducted one prevalence study and also one randomized controlled trial on the effectiveness of EMDR. So that time, most of the Syrians were actually living in the camps. But currently, if we check at the data from Ministry of Interior Affairs, we see that actually just 60,000 of refugees are now living in camps in Turkey in 7 temporary accommodation centers in 5 different cities. But as you may see, more than 3.5 million refugees are living in country. So they are in different cities. And I think there are, for instance, in Kilis, what I remember, and there are more Syrian refugees living compared to Turkish citizens. So, and also Istanbul is hosting the highest number of Syrian refugees. It is like more than 500,000 Syrians, registered Syrians, are living in Istanbul. So we are actually having not a camp situation, but we are more having an urban refugee situation. Why this is important, why I am actually underlining this, because this is also important for all the implementations, like how we're going to provide education, how we're going to provide health systems. So this has an implication on many other social and health related domains, factors. Okay, so if you look at the literature, so refugees and mental health literature, actually we see that refugees are considered as a vulnerable group, and findings from the previous research also indicates this. Faisal's study indicated that it's a bit old study, but it's one of the very good studies, and they found that refugees who resettle in Western countries could be 10 times more likely to have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, compared to the host population. So it is important because this study also highlighted that refugees are considering a vulnerable group for possible mental health problems. And if you look at more recent data, Charson's and colleagues study, which is also collaborated with WHO in 2019, indicated that conflict affected people, because they also added others, not only refugees, but conflict affected people, they have higher risk for anxiety, for depression, and for PTSD. So if you compare these rates, like for anxiety, it says that conflict affected people, among them, there's a 22% of them might have anxiety, while in the general population it's 3.6. And this difference is much more when we are talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a trauma-related disorder. And depression rates are also doubled when we are talking about refugee groups. But I also want to add this information here. If you look at the refugee literature, you're going to see that there is a kind of a little bit huge variance. So some studies find out lower rates, while some find higher rates of mental health problems. And we can explain this difference with the methodological differences, such as actually whether they had a randomized large sample size, or also the assessment tools. They are very important. So studies which use self-report assessment tools such as Beck Depression or Hopkins Symptom Checklist or PCL, they might find higher prevalence rates, while studies that are using clinician-administered tools such as SKID, CD, or MINI, they are likely to find smaller prevalence rates of mental health problems. Okay, so since in the back, we were more likely to explain, especially the post-traumatic stress disorder, which is seen high in refugee groups, we were more likely to use this war exposure model. And in this model, we are we have three categories of factors, like pre-migration, war migration related, and post-migration factors. And this model claims that mental health situation of refugees could be explained by the war trauma, war-related trauma, which is in the second group. So, and this model also claimed that there is a dose response effect, which means that with higher levels of war exposure, we would have a greater distress or a higher risk for diagnosis. This actually had some many studies also find similar results showing this relationship. And this model also is coming from Bura, let's say also his name, because this is more in the literature also is used for general migration. So what I mean that we have two types of migration, forced migration and voluntary migration, but you can of course discuss it whether a voluntary migration, imagine 1950s, 60s, you know, Turkish people went to Europe to work. So this is more like a work-related migration. We can discuss whether it is fully voluntary or not, but compared to a refugee group, which is forcibly displaced due to war, due to other conflicts, we can accept that it's more voluntary, of course. But this model of Bura, Geniş Bura, is more, or Kimayer also was using that. So these two names are more related in the migration literature. And when we are discussing the mental health problems of migrants, it was very, very helpful actually to think, to conceptualize it with these three different set of factors, risk factors. And this is seen in the literature, yes, as my war trauma increases. I also see that there's an increased possibility that I would have PTSD or other common mental health disorders. However, the strength of the effect of this war varied considerably. So the models using war exposure as the whole or primary predictor of current mental health status, they typically left a great deal of variance in symptom levels unexplained. So some of the variants left unexplained. So it means that, okay, war-related trauma is important, but there is something missing in the model. And that time we see Miller and Rasmussen's model, which is ecological model of refugee distress, which actually says that although the direct effect of war exposure on mental health and PTSD generally is important, but when we add the other post-migration difficulties, or let's say displacement-related stressors, actually the strength of the war trauma effect decreases. So this says that actually displacement-related stressors, they also mediate the impact of war trauma on current psychological well-being. And actually this is important because from a public mental health approach, a focus on ongoing stressors allows us to discuss the social determinants of mental health. Social determinants such as poverty, social determinants like discrimination or separation from family members, or uncertainty about your situation. This is something I also observed in my own field trials, that uncertainty in Turkey, because temporary protection seems to give many rights, but it is different than having a refugee status in a European country. So this actually having a temporary protection still brings some uncertainty about future. And what I also hear from the participants, not being able to receive the Turkish citizenship actually triggers these uncertainty, especially in stress times such as COVID-19. So we don't have still, we need to analyze our data, but we expect an increase also in this mental health problems of refugees during these times. So very consistently with the general mental health literature of refugees, we also see similar things in Syrian refugees. Neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, or other countries had some research, but also there are research coming from Europe, especially German and Greek colleagues. They're also providing their results. And what we see in the literature is there is a high rate of PTSD, anxiety, and depression in changing prevalence rates, but we also see that Syrian refugees are having a higher risk to have common mental health problems such as depression, PTSD, and anxiety. However, though this is a high number, high prevalence rate, we can say that we can ask about whether the mental health treatment use is high or not. So, though we have a high prevalence of mental health problems, when we look at the mental health treatment use, we see it's very low. A study from Germany found that just 5 to 10% of those who are in need of mental health treatment, Syrians, are using mental health treatment, receiving these treatments. And when they ask about the reasons, the possible reasons of this low mental health treatment use, they found that the language barrier. So that is an important barrier, especially because the huge number of refugees could also cause a burden in the health systems of the countries, hosting countries. And this means that maybe you don't have enough number of translators. Maybe you don't have enough number of mental health providers. So language barrier appeared especially a problem in Germany, and it's also in Turkey. And geographical distance to facilities. So we also hear that refugees may also say that they're very far away, or lack of knowledge, not knowing about the possible ways of the treatment facilities, or distrust of services and stigma appeared as main barriers of mental health treatment use. So if you allow me Burcu Hocam, I will just give a very short summary for other audience. Buraya kadar aslında şeyi konuştuk. Hani genel olarak dünya literatüründe mültecilerdeki ruh sağlığı problemlerini. Evet, mülteciler savaş ve diğer zorlu yaşam olayları sebebiyle ülkelerini terk etmek zorunda olan ve başka ülkelere sığınmacı olarak başvuran, yani asylum seeker dediğimiz ve sonrasında da mülteci olarak kabul edilen bir gruptan bahsediyoruz. Şimdi bu kişiler çoğunlukla bu tür yaşam olaylarından kaçtıkları için kaçış öncesi, kaçış ve kaçış sonrasında çeşitli stresörlerle maruz kalıyorlar. Yani zorlu durumlara maruz kalıyorlar. Literatüre de baktığınızda mültecilerin zaten genellikle savaştan önce de zor durumda yaşadığını söylüyor bazı yazarlar. Çünkü ne yazık ki belli ülkelerde, dünyanın belli bölgelerinde daha çok çıkıyor bu krizler ve o insanlar genelde zaten zorlu bir yaşam içinde olabiliyorlar. Bu da hem savaş sırasında yaşadıkları travmanın etkisini arttırabilir, hem de sonrasında yaşayabilecekleri kaynakları aslında biraz da düşürebilir. Fakat ilk başta bizim kullandığımız war trauma, yani savaş travmasına bağlı modelle açıklamaya çalışıyoruz. Yüksek olan TSSB, depresyon ve anksiyete oranları. Fakat o modele göre biz o modelle açıklamaya çalıştığımızda belli bir varyans çok ciddi açıkta kalıyor. Yani şu anki durumun, ruh sağlığı durumun hepsini biz sadece travmaya maruz kalmakla açıklayamıyoruz. Bunun üzerine Miller ve Rasmussen sosyal ekolojik model diye bir model ortaya çıkarıyorlar. Ve bu model aslında biraz da halk sağlığı perspektifinden bakıyor. Ve diyor ki yani sadece travmatik olay değil, sonraki yeni ülkeye gittiğim yerde yaşadığım zorluklar da benim şu anki ruhsal durumumu etkiliyor. Ve gerçekten bu modelle yapılan çalışmalar şu anki hastalık oranını daha çok açıklıyor. Yani kişinin kaçış sonrasında yeni ülkede yaşadığı ekonomik sıkıntılar, sosyal sıkıntılar, aile sorunları, diskriminasyon, ayrımcılık, bunların aslında şu anki ruh sağlığı üzerindeki etkisi çok önemli ve de göz ardı edilemez diyor. Peki Suriyelilerle yapılan çalışmalar dünyada ve Türkiye'de gerçekten depresyon, travma sonrası stres bozukluğu ve anksiyetenin Suriyeli grupta da yüksek olduğunu gösteriyor. Peki yüksekse acaba hani sağlık hizmetlerini kullanıyorlar mı? Bu Almanya'dan gelen bir çalışma ve diyor ki 5 ve 9, sadece 5'i 9'u bu kişilerin sağlık hizmetlerini kullanıyor, ruh sağlığı hizmetlerini. Ve genel kullanmama sebepleri de dil bariyeri, orada Almanca, uzak olması yaşadıkları yerlerin, belli bölgelerde yaşıyorlar çünkü muhtemelen, ve de bence çok önemli bir sorun burada nereden ne alabileceklerini bilmemek. Yani hani neye hakkım var, nerede kaynaklar var, o bilginin olmaması ve bir de hem bu servislere güvenmemek hem de aslında başlı başına bir araştırma konusu olan stigma. Yani ben böyle hizmetleri kullandığımda bizim alanımızda ruh sağlığı hizmetlerini, yani mülteciler dışında yani diğer topluluklarla baktığınızda da stigma hep böyle önemli bir konudur. Yine Suriyelilerde de bunun olduğunu görüyoruz. Deyip devam ediyorum. Okay, so now actually I was very interested in refugee mental health when I was doing my postdoc at Amsterdam University. That time I was working on another project about migrants, but when I was reading about literature, I saw that refugee literature is very much is very interesting, and especially that time there were many studies from Bosnia, and so it was always in my mind to conduct a study with refugees. So I collaborated with a group of researchers from Netherlands and other 8 countries, which is called Strengths. So in Strengths project, we aim to actually provide a framework for scaling up the delivery of a community-based mental health intervention, which is called Problem Management Plus, which was actually developed by the World Health Organization. This project is a multi-site study because we had partners. So we are in Turkey as partner. We have the coordinator from Netherlands, Vrije University Amsterdam. We have Vrije University Berlin from Germany, and we have partners from United Kingdom, Switzerland, Australia, Denmark, Jordan, and Lebanon. So we have a number of countries, and our aim is actually to increase the responsiveness of health systems across Europe and low and middle income countries surrounding Syria in order to meet the needs of Syrian refugees. So we actually aim to evaluate the feasibility, acceptability, and cost effectiveness and effectiveness of culturally adapted problem management plus. So we had a number of work packages. This is an EU project, EC project, and one of the partners work packages Turkey also worked is health systems evaluation. In this work package, we aim to analyze the responsiveness of the Turkish health systems to this Syrian crisis, and we also try to understand the contextual factors such as socioeconomic, cultural, or political factors, how we respond to these crises. But before that, we made a study in Sultanbeyli, Istanbul, in order to understand the prevalence and also predictors of common mental disorders among Syrian refugees in Turkey. And in this study, we selected a random sample out of the database of Sultanbeyli, Rasasa, we named in English Mülteciler Derneği, let's say actually. So they have a computerized database. So we randomly selected 2,000 people from them because actually more than 30,000 Syrians are registered in that area. So compared to Europe, it's really, huge numbers. So we could be able to randomize these 2,000 adult Syrians. And we had a sample half man and half human, so almost a similar race. And our sample was mostly between 25 to 45 years old age, and more than 80% were married, and they were mostly having a primary school education. So we assessed the prevalence rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And what we found, actually, 1 out of 5 our people in our sample had post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and more than 36% had anxiety, and 35% of them had depression. But I think it's important here, almost half of our sample had at least one of them, either PTSD, anxiety, or depression. I have to say that actually we didn't use a diagnostic tool like Mini or something else, but we assessed these symptoms with other valid and self-report instruments. We were also interested in the risk groups in these groups. So we examined the predictors of these mental problems, and as in the non-refugee samples, being a female appeared as a risk factor. Facing economic difficulties, also another risk factor. And having previous trauma experience, that appeared as a risk factor, and also unmet needs for social support, safety, law, and justice also appeared as significant risk factors for PTSD, anxiety, and depression. But besides that, we also found that having a lifetime history of mental health treatment and problems accessing adequate treatment, they were also related to depression and anxiety. They were not related with PTSD, but they were related with depression and anxiety. Because in the model of Bura, they also say that having a previous mental health problem actually is a risk factor for current mental health problems. And it appeared here as it is. In depression literature also, you may all know that recurrence of depression is very highly possible. First episode most of the time starts after a stressful event, but then the other recurrent episodes can start without a significant life event. But here, of course, refugees' lives, we can talk about many adversities and life events. So in the second project of study of the same project group, actually, we also checked the treatment gap. So we knew that, especially with the very high number of Syrian refugees in Turkey, actually this creates a very big demand on the Turkish mental health system. And we aim to see whether Syrians are using these mental health services or not. And we found that there is a very huge treatment gap. So just 9% of those people who were screened positive for PTSD, depression, or anxiety, and who had self-reported problems use these mental health services. And mostly, and then we of course ask about the reasons why actually you are not using mental health services. And we found that 80% said that they wanted to handle the problem on their own. And again, 80% thought the problem would get better by itself. Half of them were unsure about where to go or who to see. You remember in the German study just a second ago, we see that lack of knowledge of using mental health treatment. So it's very similar actually. Or concerned about what other people gonna think about. So it is again related with the stigma, or seeking this kind of treatment gonna make my family or myself embarrassed. So again, we see that there is a stigma related to service use for mental health disorders in Syrian group. So as this main aim of this strengths project, actually, to scale up the PM+, actually, scaling up means that using culturally adapted interventions, which are evidence-based and through which you are using task shifting. Task shifting means that you're actually, this is a debate topic, I know, what I think, actually, when there are lack of mental health professionals, I think it's important to have a trained and supervised group of lay people or non-specialists, let's say, who are also supervised through mental health specialists. Because unfortunately, there are many stressing events and adversities happening all over the world, and we may need to have, we need to increase the capacity. So task shifting is actually using non-professionals in order to provide some basic evidence-based interventions. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so actually, just 2 years ago, in November 8th, we had a workshop in Istanbul, And at that time we didn't have a COVID, so people were coming here, we were going out. So it was nice times, lovely times. Anyway, so we had this workshop because we wanted to understand actually how we can implement PM Plus in Turkish health system. So we were 24 stakeholders, 10 national and international academics and mental health researchers from Turkey, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and we had 10 staff coming from national and international NGOs such as UNHCR, Relief International, War Trauma, International Blue Crescent, and we also had psychiatrists, psychologists from the hospitals, and we had one person coming from Ministry of Health. So actually this theory of change is a participatory learning planning process in which you use to develop and implement implementation. And our aim was to end of this day to have a map like this. Okay, maybe I think you can see it here. So this is showing a pathway towards scaling up PM Plus in Turkey. And there are 3 key elements of scaling up here. Resource team. Okay, resource team is actually people who will take care of or in charge of this condition. And we all decided that research team actually should include people from Ministry of Health. So the leader of this implementation should be Ministry of Health and maybe other ministries also like Social and Family Affairs. And we also suggested there must be some academics, researchers in this group. But besides this resource team, we also need an innovation. This is the PM Plus, which I'm going to talk about. It's an intervention. So we aimed that PM Plus would be, culturally adapted PM Plus would be effective in reducing the mental health symptoms, problems, disorders of Syrian refugees, while increasing the quality of life and well-being of refugees. So we have innovation, and then we have the end user organization. And the user organization is planned to be as the refugee health centers. So the people, the professionals or non-specialist peers in these centers, refugee health centers, would be the actually user of these PM Plus. And so in collaboration with these 3 things like resource team, user organization, they would implement PM Plus throughout Turkey. So this was the aim for Syrian refugees' mental health. But before that, we also work on the adaptation. Because in scaling up evidence-based psychological interventions in different regions of the world, it is optimal to adapt the intervention to the specific context in which you're going to deliver it. And cultural adaptation is the systematic modification of an evidence-based intervention, and you consider language, culture, and context of the group that you're going to use, because you want that it will be compatible with the clients, with the participants' cultural patterns, or you need to use some metaphors which make sense for their culture, and it's also important to work on the problems which are meaningful for them. So this is one of the first steps in strengths we took. We adapted PM Plus to Syrian culture. And also we adapted the training protocols and all the manuals. And there is a systematic way of doing that. Danish Red Cross was a leader partner in this situation. And in Turkey, I should say that PM Plus is an intervention which can be given in different modalities. For instance, you can make it like one-to-one session, where Netherlands and Switzerland use that one-to-one session, or you can provide it as a group intervention. And in Jordan and in Turkey, we gave it a group intervention. So for the adaptation of group PM Plus to Syrian culture, we took a number of steps. We made 3 things: free listening interviews, key informant interviews, and focus group interviews. So our aim was to learn the main problems of Syrian refugees in Turkey. It appeared like financial problems, employment issues, language problems, social problems, and lack of trust to the system, and psychological problems. So it is like, what are all the problems that affect Syrian refugees living in Turkey? So this is a very general question. So it's not our aim to ask Burcu Hocam, what are your problems? Or Miss Ceren, what are your problems? So it is generally, what Syrians living in Turkey do you think are living? So this is the first step for listening interviews. And then as a second step, we go and talk with some Syrians and Turkish people who are working with Syrians in order to explore more about the problems, like the characteristics or symptoms of the problem, the perceived causes of the problem, or the effects of these problems, or coping methods with these problems. So there, we're actually talking more, and we had 14 key informant interviews. And then, as a final step of adaptation, or one previous final step, focus group interventions. And here we had one male and one female focus groups. And in these focus groups, we examined more about the coping ways, how Syrians cope with these problems. And some of the examples from female Syrians, like praying, reading Quran, talking with their friends. However, from the male Syrian participants, they mostly said that it is very difficult for them to cope because they have many financial problems and they don't have much time or resource to take care of themselves or their children. But mostly they also said that going to park or open places is good for them, and spending time with their families, they were named as good coping ways. So after this, we also wanted to, because we have one generic PM+, which was developed by WHO. So it's important to adapt that manual. Let me show you one here. Syrian culture, okay? For instance, this is the one, because we're also working on this PM+ for Turkish community now, currently with Ministry of Health and World Health Organization in Turkey. So we are now working on the Turkish version. But as you see, this is, for instance, not suitable for Syrians or maybe Turkish, the drawings. So probably for some places, actually, the drawings can change. So in this adaptation, we also take the book and go to Syrians and ask whether these, how do you understand this picture text, or is it relevant in your community culture? For instance, this picture, I remember we had a feedback from the participant that we don't sit like that with the door is open, and so we had to make them adjust them to the Syrian culture. So we had an adaptation workshop in Istanbul, and after that we started our implementation phase, which is actually a randomized controlled trial in order to see the effectiveness of PM+. PM+ is a brief intervention. It has just 5 sessions, and it is delivered by non-specialists, peer-to-peer. So we trained Syrians, which are mostly my students from my university that time, and to Syrians. And it is actually based on cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a transdiagnostic intervention, which means that it is not specific to any mental health disorder. It is addressing depression, anxiety, PTSD, and stress. And it is designed for people in low-income country communities with adversity, which means that there are many case examples which are actually related with these armed conflicts. So, for instance, in Turkey, we had to change some of the examples, cases, and rewrite them, which is acceptable and suitable for our country. And it is developed by WHO, and it has 4 strategies. So here you're actually teaching 4 strategies. Stress management, the first session, where you are teaching the breathing exercises. And then problem management. Here actually, this is not problem solving, because not every problem can be solvable. You cannot change the war, but you can change or manage some part of it in your life. So it's problem management, which is dividing the problems as solvable, unsolvable problems, and other things. And we also talk about behavioral activation, especially for depression. Having behavioral activation is evidence-based intervention method to get going, keep doing, and getting in action again. And also we have one session for social support. So 5-day training by master trainer to local mental health professionals is provided. This means that me and a couple of colleagues, we had this training, and then you need to give this training to lay people, providers, peer providers for 8 days. I'm just going a little bit getting speed up. So in this study, we aim to see whether PM Plus is effective in decreasing psychological distress. We had people who had psychological distress. We assessed it with Kessler 10, and who had low psychological functioning. Of course, we exclude those who have risks for suicide or other severe mental health problems like psychotic disorders. And this is a randomized controlled trial. After having them, screen them, and see whether they are eligible, we randomly allocate them either to PM Plus group or to control group, which is enhanced care as usual, where we are providing a leaflet in Arabic where they can find psychosocial interventions in Arabic. And we assess our participants before intervention, after intervention, and 3 months and 12 months after intervention. Okay, I can just very briefly show you the pilot studies results, where we actually had just 46 participants, because the aim was not an effectiveness study. The aim was actually to see whether this intervention is feasible, acceptable, and safe. So we had 24 people in our PM Plus group and 22 people in the control group. For us, it's important to learn from the dropout, because it's a group intervention, and we found that actually 30% dropped out. And main reasons of dropout was actually the day of the session. They may have some problems. For females especially, it was a problem of not getting the permission of the husband, or couldn't find someone to leave their children. And especially for men, it was not getting an approval from the manager to leave work. This is a problem. Lack of motivation, as in many studies, a man is difficult to get in attain them in the interventions. So we had the same thing. And the mobility, so they may not be there. So it's another problem, they may change their phone numbers or other things. And we aim to challenge these, solve these problems, like finding a better day, like talking about it. We had an option like Sunday afternoon, like after 5, for instance, in order to increase the attendance. And we also had a team of volunteers who were taking care of children. So this was also important. And just very briefly, we saw that actually our primary outcome measure was Hopkins symptom checklist, which is assessing psychological distress. And we found that the one in the below, actually blue is the PM Plus group. Yes, we had an increase in PM Plus, but that increase was not significantly different than the decrease that of the control group. So, but this could be explained by the being underpowered. Actually, our sample size was very small, so we may not be able to detect the difference. But for us, it was important that we had no adverse events, no serious adverse events, and we found that the dropout rate is also actually as expected. So this actually led a stage for a fully powered RCT. And we made a process evaluation, and we found that 17 qualitative interviews we conducted to see whether it is acceptable, feasible. Actually, we found that it was received in a very positive way. And most of the participants said that they learned some strategies, they used these strategies. And this process evaluation, we had 5 people from dropout group, 5 people who attended all sessions, and 5 people coming from their families, and 2 facilitators actually. Some said that the program is long because it's a group session, so it took 2 hours. And some said that they had their children, so it's difficult, or they have to work, or they said that they felt embarrassed to tell people that they are coming to a psychological problem. So again, we see that this was a little bit stigmatization for them. But mostly they found that the facilitators are very well and the content was very well. So they actually had a positive perspective about PM+. And the last project is Redefine. Just briefly, I can say that if you look at here, early identification of vulnerable groups as a prevention strategy could be very helpful actually. So following from this model, we aim to examine a prevention program, which is also developed by World Health Organization, Self-Help Plus. And here, very similarly, we conducted an RCT, randomized controlled trial. And here we assessed 600 Syrians in Mardin mostly. And in this project, we are now analyzing our data, so I cannot share the results yet, but we assessed them before the intervention, which is again a group intervention, 5 sessions. And our aim this time was to see whether Self-Help Plus would be useful in lowering the incidence of any mental health disorders assessed by DSM-5. And here our primary outcome measure was 6 months diagnosed with MINI, and we hypothesized that our group in the Self-Help Plus would have lower incidence rates compared to the control group. And this is Self-Help Plus is based on acceptance and commitment therapy. This is a very brief intervention, and it is self-guided. And so there is a book and there's an audio, and it is 5 sessions, 2 hours, 20 to 30 people in each group, and peer-to-peer again. So we are also using task shifting, and it is using mindfulness exercises and acceptance and commitment therapy's main value-oriented approach. But it is, of course, a very, very low intensity intervention. So now, currently data analysis. Friday, we're going to talk about it. So it's a very exciting time for us. And mostly we recruit our sample from Mardin, but we also recruit some from Fatih. So this is the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to answer your questions. Thanks for your interest.
So thank you very much, Ceren Hocam, for this informative presentation. And we have some questions, I think, in YouTube. You can also write your questions here in our Zoom meeting. You are only limited participants, but we can also have some questions from YouTube. I saw a question, for example. Okay. What do you think about, before asking about Syrian culture, aren't the both culture, Turkish and Syrian, are already similar from many aspects? So why we are differentiating between the 2 cultures? It's a question.
Why we are, sorry, can you just repeat that part, Burcu Hocam?
Yes. Why are we differentiating? Why do we differentiate between the 2 cultures, Turkish and Syrian culture? What's your experience?
Yeah, actually, even at the same culture, you may have some sub-differences, subgroups, and I think it is not I think it's always better to pick more information about the specific cultures. For instance, language appeared as a very big problem. So when you say that, okay, we have very similar points between Syrian and Turkish culture, but on the other hand, I remember my first experiences with Syrians, like there were many different small groups among some groups, and I found that why this is like that, and they said some cities may be different, even some dialects can be different. So even in Syrian culture, we may have different groups. But in the cultural adaptation, so when you think about that, this is a generic WHO developed intervention. So it is not all, it wasn't for Turkish culture. So that intervention needs to be adapted to the specific to the culture of the participants, the beneficiaries. But of course, many similar things, like especially I see in Mardin. So I had a chance to work both in Istanbul and Mardin field. So I have two teams working in Istanbul and Mardin. And in Mardin, Syrians have less post-migration living difficulties because language is similar. So they can easily find someone who can talk in Arabic. It's very different, actually. So even in the same country, we can see difference. Or in Sultanbeyli or Fatih, Syrians may differ in terms of socio-economic levels or other things. So you can see the differences. But thanks for this good question.
Yes, I can like from my experience. We conducted a study with Red Crescent, and in this project we interviewed some Syrian refugees, and they also told some similar problems. They have we asked their problems, and they told us that they have some cultural problems. They have some cultural difficulties. It was very surprising for me because I have self a migration experience, but I studied in Europe. It was that's why I thought I could empathize with this group. But I thought it's very different for the Syrian refugees in Turkey because we have a similar culture, we have the same religion. But after I had these interviews, it was very surprising for me because they were claiming that they have really difficulties in all days in their all days routines in the society, etc.
I remember one of the participants said that actually Turkish people are working a lot, like, it's work oriented. So work is in very center of your life. So you always talk about work or, work. So we may have differences, of course, but maybe in our mind, would you right? I also studied in Netherlands. It's different. And I would expect more common things with Syrian and Turkish culture. But when we ask them, it's different. There are many differences.
Yes, perhaps in order to respond their needs better, we have to concentrate on
of course.
such culture.
Yes.
Ceren Hocam, based on one of the comments on YouTube, I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the chosen title of the talk. Why is a lot of the research in this area focusing on Syrian refugees and the mental health that they are experiencing? It is something obvious to us as clinical psychologists, but I just want to give you an opportunity to elaborate on it.
Great, Fatih Hocam. Can you just repeat the first part of your question? What did they write in YouTube? I couldn't see that. Yeah.
It was with regards to the title itself.
The title of my presentation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Why is it focusing on Syrian refugees and their mental health? Like, why are we focusing on that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, mental health is a little bit neglected area of health in general. And of course, we are mental health professionals, so we see that you cannot have a full health without mental health. This is also something WHO is also claiming. When we talk about health, we mean that also we include mental health. And if you consider that when people go through stressful life events, actually, even in COVID situation, you can imagine how it is you are experiencing this situation. For instance, in refugees, what we expect that being locked down actually might trigger the times if they were in war area, for instance. So they might have some triggers, or the uncertainty may trigger the previous experiences. So when we are talking about refugees, I think we should definitely include mental health. And maybe I will also take this opportunity to tell that it's it's not only Syrians. Turkey is also hosting huge number of Afghan people, African people. So we also need to consider their needs. And I think it's important to see each other's needs and problems and also resources. It is better, we shouldn't ignore these problems. For instance, I see the funds from Europe are coming for Syrian studies, but there are also Afghan people, as I said, or African people who are not, who don't have legal situations, so which makes that they cannot send their children to schools. And I think this is really important. This is causing a lost generation, actually. Now we are talking about how our children losing the opportunity to educate, get more education, lost generation. But for years, other children, Afghan children or African children, they cannot go to school. This is not, Syrian children can go now. But if you think about as a community, like let's say Turkish community, Turkey community, how we want to say, we need to take care of each children living here without the ethnicity or the nationality. So for this reason, with my student, PhD student, Gülşah Kurt, we just started another study, which has just a fund from Koç University, thanks to them, in order to understand the main problems of Afghan people, Afghanistan, refugees from Afghanistan, and then to see, because we need to highlight, we are researchers, mental health researchers, and we need to highlight, find out the main problems. And then I think it's important, it's a responsibility to make statements for policy makers.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the jump. I also have a very trivial question. I was just wondering, how did you guys manage to get so many participants to complete the survey, close to 2,000?
Actually, we had I am lucky. I really had great students. I'm really lucky. And I had a great group of bilingual young people, very bright young people, mostly Arabic speaking. And with their help, actually, we had a good, very big team for the assessments. But also, I think for this kind of a study, it's very important to have an implementing partner. So it's important to collaborate with, like, I think that collaboration is very important. NGO, academy, and government institutions. It's very important to provide more research and services. So, and that was okay with their help, the Mülteciler Derneği or in Mardin, other NGOs, but mostly the young people who are really very much motivated. And sometimes you feel tired after age 40. So their motivation is good for us. They don't stop.
And in that survey, did you guys look at instances of trauma or number of instances that they might have been exposed to?
Yeah, we also had this Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, and there we also both look at the number and also the type of the trauma, but we didn't analyze it yet.
Okay.
So we just had the survey that you said in Sultanbeyli. We had the presence of any trauma, but in the other strength survey, in general one, and the RCT, we will be also able to see, because there we use Harvard Trauma Questionnaire. We have all the types and the numbers.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, those Syrians who seem to be suffering from PTSD, how many of them, might have been exposed to a single instance of trauma versus multiple instances? Yeah, I was just curious.
We will be, actually, we will be able to do that. We will be in the both studies. We will be able to see the mediators, the moderators, to analyze all of them.
Okay.
Okay. Our time is over. Thank you very much, Ceren Hocam.
I thank you a lot for hosting me.
Thanks so much for the informative and interesting presentation, Hocam. I hope your research studies will contribute more to the mental health needs of our Syrian refugee community.
Thank you very much, Fatih Hocam, Burcu Hocam, for everyone who are here. Thanks a lot for hosting me.